recorded at Medicines from the Earth in June of 2014. For more information on our conferences, lecture notes, and recordings, visit our website, botanicalmedicine.org.
We went through the adrenal fatigue picture and the importance of nourishing the body, and we kind of hit on it in the panel this morning a little bit too. And I think that, again, the big issue here is chronic stress. We're talking about chronic stress and a society that's just stressed out all the time. And running the chronic stress pattern is different than having an acute stress where you're on your motorcycle and you wipe out or you're in a car accident, right? We're going to talk about how the two things together make for a really big problem. Chronic stress. So we talked about fibromyalgia and we talked about chronic fatigue syndrome. I think Lyme disease is an interesting aspect to this because we're going to get into autoimmunity, so I'm not going to go into infectious disease. But interesting what David was saying about Lyme disease. If you weren't in the panel, we talked a little bit about Lyme disease as a question came in. And David's big message was, hey guys, if you got a tick bite, you got a little deer tick bite, a little micro tick bite, and you get it, and you think you might have got Lyme disease, your best route is probably go get doxycycline and probably do 2 to 4 weeks, and just make sure you don't have it. And I've advised people many times in that direction. Most of the time, people are coming to you with a tick bite, it's a big tick, and it's, they have redness, they have erythema. Well, that doesn't mean they have Lyme disease. But Lyme disease is complex, and it's not one disease, it's not one microorganism, it's many. And David was saying that it existed even in the guy they found in the ice that they pulled up in Europe, like the 5,000-year-old caveman type of person, or was sort of like an evolved, tattooed, acupuncturist kind of guy from way back in the day, who had Lyme disease apparently. That's why they buried him? Yeah, because he was infected? Yeah. Well, is it contagious? That's another question. He wasn't doing his job. He was like a cancer cell. He was an aberration. But I want to get back to the idea that it's like what Linus Pauling said on his deathbed. It's about the soil. Because I don't think that suddenly one of us is going to get a huge exposure to Lyme disease and you're going to have Lyme disease and that's it, you're going down. I think your immune system can fend off Lyme disease, and I think that we're all exposed to it a lot more than we might think, and I think that you might find titers are available for observation sometimes, and they're not at other times. And I think that you might have latent infection that you don't know about that could flare up when you get really sick, when you're really deficient, once you're in this depleted state. And that's why I think the metaphor or the analogy of chronic fatigue syndrome and this viral infection that underlies it, and the idea like of mononucleosis, where the kissing disease, as it was told to me, where you basically just get chronic fatigue or this crushing fatigue that lasts for a long time, and you just can't get out of it. And that kind of a situation, I feel like, is the stress pattern is run, and there's a huge emotional component to it. Absolutely, nowadays kids are on Facebook, and we have the highest rates of suicide now in young kids because they're getting bullied on Facebook. I mean, the bullying that's happening isn't even happening on the real, it's in the virtual realm, but the emotional stress, the increase in heart rate, the driving of the stress response is driving people to not only show up with all these kinds of infections, but also to actually kill themselves. So the depth of how this stress goes is very profound and very real. And I just want to we're talking about botanical medicine, but a big part of our work is just being with people and helping them understand their stress response and not try to get rid of it or tell them that it's not there, but just to be with them. And like David said, you listening. Just listen to somebody tell you how stressed out they are. That allows them to vent off a lot of that pent-up energy, and then they can just start to relax. So in this representation of a protocol I built for a person, she had HHV6, so that's the human herpes virus 6. And just in case you're thinking HSV, the herpes simplex viruses, those are HHV 1 and 2. And there's HHV through 8. Am I right, Neil? About 8 of those. And, there's a lot of herpes viruses that are in humans. HHV6 is one that I've been finding in the clinic pretty commonly. It shows up as this really, again, it's just this chronic fatigue, joint pain, memory fog, memory loss, inability to multitask, those kind of symptoms manifesting under this kind of What's going on with me? What's wrong? Nobody can find anything. And then you do this test for the virus, and you find out that there's a viral load, and there's an antibody towards the virus, and you have a viral titer, in this case, and this is a chronic fatigue patient that has an active HSV6 infection. And so this is how I treated it. I have a granule formula there, and the granule formula I put in every protocol that I make generally. And it's if people can do it, it's basically a powdered extract of herbs. It's pre-decocted, and then they basically take the decoction, spray it onto screens. It dries. They shake the dried herb onto the ground, onto like a collection area, and they gather up all the crystals, and you have a 5-to-1 or 6-to-1 extract that then you rehydrate with water, and it becomes a tea. Now, of course, talking about the bitter flavor, it can be really potent if you're using really strong herbs. It will taste very strong, and some people have a hard time with that. I also have a potato starch circular, it's like a rice paper, and you can put the herbs inside of there, roll it up, and swallow it that way, since people have a hard time with the taste. But I always use a granule formula because that's like my traditional Chinese medicine diagnosis. The pattern I see in the person, I'm going to treat them constitutionally for what I see, whether it's heat, dampness, or damp heat, if it's cold, if it's blood stagnation, qi stagnation, if it's liver qi stagnation, liver yin deficiency, heart blood deficiency, kidney heart disharmony. What do I see in this person? That's my system, my primary principle-based system of diagnosis, and I want to always emphasize that for you guys, no matter what we're talking about. It's not a this for that type of a treatment that I'm invested in teaching you. I want to teach you how to find out what your patient needs. So use whatever system you have. And be careful of the prescriber tradition, the idea that, treatment A is for disease A. That's the lowest level of medicine we have, really. You want to be a scholar. You want to have, and I think that principles are so important. You have to have principles. Principles you can apply to the materials, and principles you apply to the people, and then you combine them so the principles match. And then you get a treatment that works. And it's going to be really important when we're talking about herbs in autoimmunity as well. But so in adrenal support tincture, I talked about that yesterday. That's kind of our adaptogenic formula that's based on a number of herbs that support an adaptive stress response. It helps to modulate the way that cortisol, the glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and the other stress hormones interact, and how you can keep them buffered. You can still have their effect, the steroidal action, without stressing the system out, and you kind of modulate and ameliorate some of the system feedback loops that get in the way of proper functioning, balanced functioning. So I'll have to take a look at that tincture too. I put the B complex there. B vitamins, very important for cofactors. So when you want to make something happen in the body, go from one hormone to another, conjugate one part of a toxin to get rid of it, you need B vitamins. So a good B complex, something that you're comfortable with, a good whole food B vitamin complex is good. Sometimes people need one specific one, but in this case, I like to just include a basic B complex. Make sure it's either whole food and or it's methylated, meaning it's reduced, okay? Because a lot of people, as we're talking about genes and epigenetics, for whatever reason, dietary changes, emotional stress, people aren't converting those B vitamins from their form that they're normally found in foods or in their supplement down into their reduced form, which is the form we use as the cofactor, whether it's in the Krebs cycle, whether it's in gene transcription. But we need enough of those compounds present in the body that we want to do something. That piece is there. We're not missing that piece. Okay? So herbs can't give you that material. So that's why for me it's herbal and nutritional medicine together. That's where we get a big advantage in just using one or the other, because they work together. The herbs are directors of function. They're full of compounds that are interacting with your body and directing the manufacture of enzymes. They're telling things where to go. They're influencing the rebuilding of tissues. They're they're pulling things out of the liver, helping the liver do its job of metabolism. And then the building blocks, the materials you use to make all those directing, the compounds that are being directed, are the nutrients. So that's why I want to talk about some of the nutrition. It's really important to have both. Just so you guys think, from my perspective, the top nutrient deficiencies, magnesium, okay? Especially in these chronic fatigue syndromes. Over 300 known enzymatic reactions depend on magnesium, okay? And there's several forms. I was talking about magnesium malate yesterday because it's a big one for malic acid, has a big role in the Krebs cycle, and a lot of our fibromyalgic patients have problems with energy metabolism. So the malic acid part of the Krebs cycle, you can get the malic acid in there. I use magnesium malate together as a chelate, so it's magnesium, salt, the salt of malic acid with magnesium, okay? So that's what I use. And the dosage is anywhere from 400 to 1,500 milligrams. It just depends on the person's tolerance. I always start at a low dose, and I build up slowly because bowel movements, get going. And it's great because a lot of people need to get that bowel movement thing happening. They need to help with that aspect. But you can scare people off real quick if you give them too much magnesium. It's much better to slowly build up and take more time than it is to suddenly get somebody to where they have, they're rushing to the bathroom, they don't make it, and they're never going to want to take magnesium again. So I'm very cautious about that.
What's DMH?
Oh, that's Designs for Health. That's a company. Those are just the companies. This is an actual protocol that I gave to a patient. I didn't take all the companies I used off. I like Designs for Health. They do a really good job with their products. This is the adrenal. That's pure encapsulations. That's the adrenal complex that I was telling you about. It's a whole adrenal glandular from an organic free-range source. Vitamin D. The relationship of vitamin D to the immune system I'll hit a little bit later in this talk, but we've got to get vitamin D levels into the normal range, and I'll talk about what normal is and how we determined that. Zinc, the top three nutrients, magnesium, zinc, selenium, okay? Depleted in our soils, used up in our systems as cofactors. We need to replenish those. So I generally give my patients those three things, especially if I don't quite know exactly what a person needs. I don't have genetic information. I don't have a bunch of lab work. I'll make sure they have those things. And then the B vitamins, and then as a hormone, vitamin D. It's more of a hormone than it is a vitamin, right? It's a hormone. It goes directly into the DNA of every cell in our body and influences function. It's not something that the body grabs and uses and actively transports around. It just goes right in through the phospholipid bilayer, goes into the cell, and directs function. Really important. Cerephos, I put that in here. Again, this is, remember, when you're giving the whole adrenals, some people get a stimulation during the process of rebuilding their adrenal activation network. We have the hypoactivation of the person with chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia where they're not getting enough cortisol to actually shut down their reflex response. So the hypothalamus is constantly asking and asking and asking for more. You've shut that down and slowed it down. But sometimes people still have a little cortisol circulating at night, and we want the cortisol to be low. So phosphatidylserine, that's the compound. This is phosphorylated serine from this company, Ayush. You can use whichever one, but it needs to be phosphorylated serine or phosphatidylserine, and that will help soak up cortisol at night. So I try to reset the circadian rhythm. Give people cortisol in the morning, first waking, the highest amount, then a little bit less at noon, and then phosphatidylserine at night, and sometimes melatonin at night. So you're resetting the cycle, and you've got to get rhythm. Remember I was talking about rhythm as the most important thing for the adrenals, rhythm. Not just because I'm a drummer, but that helps. It's definitely good. The silver, the stamina, don't worry about that. That's just a botanical protocol, but a formula. The silver I use in this case, I love colloidal silver as a treatment for viruses, bacteria, also for fungus. I dose it really high because that's what works. And there's never been any toxicity with any patient I've ever treated. And there are 2 people in this country who have ever had the one side effect that's documented, and it's called argyria. AG is the acronym for silver on the periodic table, and so you get argyria, which means basically your skin turns blue. 2 people. Interestingly enough, one of them lives in Ashland. His name's Dax, and he was on the Today Show because he was the Green Man. You guys might have seen that episode. It was like maybe 10 years ago. But he and the other guy who was a senator, I think in Kentucky, I can't remember his name, but they both electrolyzed their own silver. So they had a silver cathode anode system where they would run electricity through the current, and they'd pull the anions of silver into solution, and they'd be big particles, there'd be tons of them. They didn't analyze it. So they were just into drinking it every day as a protection from disease, from infection, because there's a huge antimicrobial action of silver. Now, of course, it is a charged ion. Chlorine is a charged ion. Fluorine is a charged ion. Those are halogens, but the silver is on the other side of the spectrum. It's a metal. It has a positive charge, but it still works the same way. It damages the bacteria, damages the viruses through their oxidative reaction. So I don't want to give anything like this long term. I wouldn't do it every day long term like Dax is doing. But like I said, argyria, there's no actual pain or suffering or disease associated other than you turn blue. But like I said, only if you make your own silver, huge parts per million, huge particle size, and take a ton of it every day. So if you do want to turn blue, That's the recipe. And if you don't, use a good silver that doesn't have big particles and doesn't have a huge, part per million. I use a 200 part per million silver. The stuff you get in the store, the sovereign silver you can see at any food store, that's a hydrosol. It's a very small particle, and it's normally 10 parts per million. So I would dose the 10 part per million one in a patient that has an active disease, if it was Lyme disease or hepatitis, and I wanted to add something, or if someone's in the hospital with meningitis, I would be giving them a bottle, like a 4-ounce bottle, 3 times a day. That's the kind of dosing of that stuff. So that's why I use the 200 part per million. The dosing is 1 ounce twice a day for the first day, separated by 6 hours. This works wonders. I mean, I have had a lot of infections get well. Even when people were sick in the hospital, they've done antibiotics, they've done everything they could, and you just get them on high doses of silver plus your herbs, and they do really well. You can pull people out of really bad situations. 2 doses, 1 ounce each, first day. Then for every day after that, generally 2 to 4 weeks, it's a teaspoon 3 times a day. So that's part of my remedy. Now, for her, this person, she was doing 1 teaspoon 3 times a day for the first couple of weeks to get this virus knocked down because she was so weak and so fatigued, her immune system wasn't mounting a strong, fight against this virus. It wasn't going away. So I can't just build her up. I wanted to build her up, but then also knock back the virus. So I did the 2 things together. Okay? Throat and gland spray, this is a lymphagogue formula, baptisia, usnea, echinacea, a great combination of herbs to help the lymph system move. A lot of propolis in that formula. You had a question?
Can we excrete any of the silver?
As silver? Yeah, definitely. Renally excreted. Yep. Inflamaway, this is another combination. This is an antiviral. One of the reasons I have that formula, I could have just put Angiographis in there. It's one of my favorite antivirals. The Chinese name is Chuan Xin Lian. It's the king of the bitters. You talk about bitter, it's really bitter. But it's great for viruses. And it's in the category of herbs to clear heat and toxins in Chinese medicine. And it has a group of compounds called andrographolides, which are highly antiviral. It works wonders. And then I have mushroom extract, PSK. This is a Coriolis extract. It actually should say PSP. It's a polysaccharide fraction extracted from the mushroom. So this is kind of like a way that it's a pretty elaborate protocol, but for somebody who's been suffering for a long time, her husband has, advanced cancer, she's under a lot of stress, she's got this viral load, she's got fatigue, she's trying to manage her family, it's not working out. And she actually was seeing a naturopath and she just was not doing well. He got her on kind of an antiviral regimen with drugs, and it just didn't work. So she came to me. She's been doing fantastic. Took about 2-3 weeks to start seeing really good results. Now we're about 4 months out, and she's pretty much living her life normal. So I don't find these type of things, these viruses, to be really hard to treat if you get them close to the beginning of when they first are manifesting. But I've had some other patients that came in who have had lifelong chronic fatigue, who I don't ever cure their disease, but we manage it, and they're able to live a life that's a little bit more full of energy. You guys have any questions on that? Do I have the lab work for her? It was a high titer. I don't remember what it was exactly. I can't remember the number. Sorry, I should have brought that case. Should have brought a case study for you. No, I wouldn't even have. I would have treated her very similarly without ever seeing the lab work. I just had it come from her medical doctor and her naturopath. All the lab work came in, so I saw she had the viral titer. What I would have done is I would have treated her first, probably for more of the adrenal stuff, more of the top stuff, and we would have gotten to see, well, that didn't work as well. There's still something going on. Look for some infectious stuff, a low-grade fever, things like that might indicate an infection. Then I would add some other things if I didn't have the lab work, because I don't always treat by the numbers. I don't always treat by labs.
What brand of the silver did you use?
I'm using a brand called Results RNA. It's promoted by Gary Gordon. He doesn't own the company, but he's a doctor who's done a great job of building something called the FACT Forum, F-A-C-T. It's an online forum, a bunch of doctors. They're kind of into chelation, some of them, but a lot of them are also just really wonderful doctors who have developed therapies for all kinds of things that are really useful. I find it very useful. I get an update almost every day, 3 new, moderated answers to questions that come up, and you can probably just get on the forum really easily, FACT Forum. Here's an idea of a granule formula for her. This top formula I'm going to talk about a little later. This is the Angelica decoction to build the blood. It's one of my favorite classical formulas, but I'm going to save it for a little while. White peony, great liver-moving herb, softens the liver, nourishes the blood. Chuanxiang is a qi-moving herb that with Angelica will also nourish the blood. Prepared aconite here. This is a Chinese herb, fuzi. And I only get it from one source. It's from Heiner Fruhoff, his farm in China. He took 10 years to develop. And this herb came from the Li Fire School of Chinese medicine about 1300. And it's the most hot substance we have. And if you know what aconite napellus, monkshood, is from our Western herbs, it's the coldest herb we have, pretty much. For me, it'll sedate the nerve energy to the point where a 5 milliliter dose of a 1 to 10 ratio will kill a person, just put you into respiratory arrest. That's how cold, and it just drops the energy, drops the nerve energy to nothing. That's our aconite. So they have a similar plant, but they've taken the root, and traditionally they've put it in a long cook and then pulled off certain layers of the stuff that comes to the surface. This is all the sort of toxic stuff that would be neurosuppressive. And what they're left with is this very hot substance, the most yang activating substance that we have in our whole repertoire in Chinese medicine. Aconite, fuzi, prepared. So that's in here for her because she's very cold as well. She has that kind of cold, hypothyroid type of picture and she's pale, she's wan, she just needed more lift. And so I got her yang energy up by adding that plant. And that's one that you need to dose over time and you kind of understand how it works. But I find it to be one of those like magical tools. Like you need the 7-star bit for that person. You just put it in there and it turns the screw. That's the one. It's really magical. Cinnamon, Romania, wild asparagus, those are all kind of the shudi and shungi, the Romania, that's the prepared, and the other form of Romania, the raw, and the tianmendong, the wild asparagus, in Ayurveda, shatavari. Those are very moistening herbs. So we're back to, I wanted to moisten up her system, get her back to that juicy part of her that she wasn't feeling anymore. Diascorea, same thing. The fructus corneu, that's a good astringent herb. And then this vine, Loescher tongue, is a really nice one for invigorating the blood and breaking up stagnation in the joints, so for joint pain. And then some Schizandra, which astringes the essence of the body and has a lot of great biomedical actions as well. Then there's a tincture here. You can just see what I put there. It's a basic adaptogenic formula. I give it a little extra boost. It's got the Korean ginseng, and it's also got the pantocrine. And I use the white Korean ginseng, which is not as hot. Because, when they did all the research on adaptogens, the Russians in the 50s, Lazarev especially, they were looking at how to stimulate people who are working in factories, astronauts, how to keep them awake, military personnel flying long hours, how do they keep them awake and alert when they're under a lot of pressure without much sleep. And they used methamphetamines first. They tried to give them little bits of cocaine, little bits of methylphenidate to try and stimulate them, but there was always a downside. There was a crash. So they started using adaptogens, and the first one they used was ginseng. Korean ginseng. And that was too heating for some people. It would give them a little flush, would kind of elevate their blood pressure a little bit, make them a little nervous. Some people get anxious with that plant because it's real strong and warming. That's why Chinese say don't use it if you're under 35 in general. The old Taoist thing is that once you're over 35, take it every day. When you're under 35, don't take it. So I don't use that. I always just treat people for what they have. If a kid is really deficient, I'll give them ginseng. It's just, you got to be observing the constitution. But then when that plant was too hot, they began to research Eleutherococcus senticosus, Wu Jia Pi. That plant is neutral in nature, and it was traditionally used to nourish the liver and kidney and get rid of what's called wind damp. But now we've kind of thought of it as the chief adaptogen, the king adaptogen, because people don't react to it. It helps people sustain energy over long periods, and I've got tons of research on it, tons of data. There's something like 2,000 plus studies on that plant, and I use that as the chief herb in most of my adaptogen formulas. I haven't found a downside to it hardly at all, and part of that's because it's neutral nature, so it's not hot or cold, so it doesn't really influence constitution in that way. You guys understand what I mean by hot and cold? For me, that's one of the primary principles. I always go back to my 8 principles. Is the disease or the person or the plant hot or cold? Is the disease internal or external? Is it a yang condition, quick, fast, hot, rising, going outward? Or is it a yin condition, slow, chronic, low grade? And then, is it an excess condition or a deficiency condition? Is this something that's excessive? Like, is this a damp heat in the liver condition with an infection that's just creating this outward expression of lots of hot energy that's coming out of the person with elevated blood pressure, a big bounding pulse, a high fever? Or is this a deficiency condition where the person has a blood deficiency or an essence deficiency and things are in a subdued function? Those principles are absolutely essential to me to finding the right treatment. I I added some Cordyceps for her, which is a great kidney tonic. It's also for the kidney and lung, great in asthma. When the lung is weak because of a weakness underneath it of the kidneys, I go back to adrenal kidney fatigue with asthma all the time. It starts in most people very young. Then we have the Russian spikenard, Aurelia manchurica, a little American ginseng, and some licorice. And I use licorice primarily as a harmonizer because it marries formulas, it reduces toxicities from other herbs, it relaxes the tissues, and it supports digestion, tonifies the spleen. Licorice. It's an amazing substance. And we'll talk about that pseudo-hyperaldosteronism, which doctors always tell you never give your patients licorice because their blood pressure is going to go off the roof. We'll talk about that. Okay, so here we are at the lecture today. Are there any questions on the end of that one?
Jason, which one did you say for the asthma?
Cordyceps.
Thank you.
Yep. And it's funny, actually, one of the classic formulas is the gecko and cordyceps formula. Yeah, for the kidney-lung disharmony. And they actually have these geckos on a stick. They dry them. Wow. I love geckos. I don't really want to use them like that. So we're talking about stress, trauma, triggers, cascades, immune-modulating plants and compounds. I just want to talk about a couple of them that are in the limelight right now, and they're being accused of being problematic, in autoimmune conditions, and I want to kind of dispel some of that myth. So here's our wonderful Da Vinci painting here, immune system, and what I put up here is self versus non-self. That's the primary job of the immune system, to determine what is self and what is not self. If that system isn't working right, if self is identified as non-self, there's a problem. And if non-self is identified as self, there's a problem. So the idea of non-self being identified as self, cancer is a great example. Cancer says, nope, we're not the drugs you're looking for. We're fine. We're good. I'm here. Everything's fine. They put up a wall around the cancer so they look like normal tissue to the immune system. The immune system goes, well, are you okay? Are you normal? Oh, you're fine. Okay, good. Yep, fine. But really, that's a defective cell. But it has a mechanism to evade the immune system. And the cancer has many mechanisms, and that's one of them, to evade the immune system. Shutting down apoptosis is another one, where the immune system says, oh, you are defective. Why don't you die? And then the cell says, no, I don't want to. That's apoptosis, being inhibited by cancer. Cancer cells lose the apoptosis. So when I think about the immune system as a whole, we've got this deep relationship, like I talked about yesterday, between the endocrine and the neuroendocrine systems. So you've got the secreting glands, the neurological connection of them to the spine, and then out into the musculoskeletal system. That's the endocrine system woven into the neuroendocrine system. You can't separate the immune system as this separate thing over here and say, we're talking about the immune system here. You can't. They're all woven together. And we're going to get into talking about chemokines, interleukins, interferons, cytokines, cellular-made compounds that induce actions in the body, inflammatory cytokines. We'll talk about hormones, neurotransmitters. They're all working together. There's an interplay here. It's woven. It's not these isolated, separate systems, okay? So I got the immune system gets pretty complicated. I just threw up a little bit of, this little map. And we actually have an immunologist with us here, Dr. Neil here, who's schooling me up on some of the details here. Of course, I was, after talking to him, I'm like, oh God, I'm giving this talk on the immune system. I'm like going to have I got these two doctors in here that are like teaching me everything I need to know about the immune system and showing me what I don't know. But that's okay. This is not an immunology class. It's really how do we deal with autoimmunity and understand it in a way that allows us to treat it with botanical medicine. I don't want to go into this much, but it's just kind of an idea of, some of the layers of complexity that we have just in the immune system aspect of our whole neuroendocrine self. So we have two different forms of immunity primarily, right? Innate and adaptive. That's common for most of you guys? The difference between the two? Innate immunity, right? It's non-specific, okay? It's just something happens, an invader occurs, you get an abrasion, something invades the body, and you have a response. The body responds to it in the moment, right now. And it's macrophages. They're like your primary antigen-presenting cells. They're cells that go out there and find out what's going on. They clean up the garbage. They tell other cells what to do. They're like supermen. They start out as monocytes in the blood, and then once they're activated, they become macrophages. It's kind of like Clark Kent becoming Superman. It's like once there's a problem, the suit comes off, and the Superman outfit comes out, and they go to huge size, and they become really powerful. So this is like one macrophage interfacing with a whole bunch of other invaders. So another one that's really important here is the natural killer cell. Natural killer cells are part of the innate immunity. And they're really interesting because they're not confined to a lot of the rules that the other cells that are trained in the thymus, like T cells and B cells, they're not confined to as many rules. They're allowed to do kind of their own policing, make decisions on their own. They're always making decisions. And that's a really important aspect because increasing natural killer cell numbers and efficacy with plants doesn't mean that the immune system is suddenly going crazy. It means that the immune system is going to start making better decisions. There's more of these kind of like rangers out there to figure out what's going on and make a decision about what we need to do about it. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? That's really important. So natural killer cells are one of the most, one of the places we can really have big influence with plants. But this system here, the innate immunity, doesn't confer a long-lasting immunity. It's not a remembered thing. Each pathogen, each situation is something new. The body has to adapt to it today, right now, okay? So then we have adaptive immunity. This is our antigen-antibody complex immune system. And I'm not going to talk about complement, okay? It's too complicated. This is another layer. I'll mention it. But so it's very specific. It's based on you had an infection, the innate response came out, the macrophages, natural killer cells, and then other aspects, the T cells and the macrophages, grab a hold of pieces of what this thing is, bring it back into the lymph system, and show it to the memory B cells and the T cells, and then they say, oh, do we have a record of that, of what that thing is or not? And if you don't, well, let's make something for it. Let's make an antibody for it. That's why these compounds, which could be viruses like this guy right here, or some kind of a toxin, a bacteria, a fungus, you can make an antibody to something that's called an antigen because the word antigen, you hear that word all the time, actually means antibody generator. So it's a compound that generates an antibody. So when your immune system sees that thing, it says, oh, that's not me. That's something that I need to build an antibody towards that I can stick onto that part of not me, identify it, have it be separate from everything else, and let those macrophages go up and chew it up, take it apart, and get rid of it and get out of my body. So this is the adaptive immune response, okay? You always talk about immunoglobulins, right? Immunoglobulins are antibodies. That's our form of antibodies, okay? These are these components here that on the edges of this virus that are sticking on to its proteins, and the next slide will show us more about what immunoglobulins are. So the adaptive immune cells, primarily the T cells and our B cells. And then there's different layers of T cells, or T regulatory cells. There's T effector cells. There's CD4, CD8. It goes on and on. It's very complex. What we've learned when we get down to the microcosm of the immune system, it's very complex. But I don't want to go too deep into that, so we'll just kind of move on to what I thought was important, which is immunoglobulins. So when we're testing people for sensitivities to foods, when we're looking at their titers for things like H. pylori or for a virus, we're looking at different types of immunoglobulins that are present in their bloodstream. So basically, the body's been exposed to something. It's identified that thing as NonSelf. It's made a response to that thing, which is an antibody that's been produced by the memory cells, released into the bloodstream, and it's stuck to the antigen. And now you have an antigen-antibody complex. You can measure how much of those immunoglobulins are circulating at any given time, and sometimes it tells you there's an overt infection going on. There's actually a response happening, or it could tell you that the person was exposed at some point in the past. And you use different immunoglobulins for different diseases, and that's a whole other layer of immunology that we have to get into to define, for specific disease, what immunoglobulin do you look at, and which one is associated with disease now, which one's associated with disease you had in the past. Does that make sense? Everybody follow me? I'm not losing people, I hope. No? Boring you? Get some drums out? Okay. So this is really interesting. We have this sort of, we shape these immunoglobulins based on our needs. I just want to put up there for you guys the IgA. You see it in the breathing passages, the GI tract, the ears, mucous membranes. It's in our saliva, our tears, and our blood. IgG, the smallest one, most common. It's like 75 to 80% of our immunoglobulins are IgG. They're fighting bacteria and viral infections. IgM, the largest one, found in the blood, that's our first response to infection. So obviously in a lot of diseases, you look at IgM and you'll see if they have active disease, they probably have an elevated IgM titer. IgE, the lungs, the skin, mucous membranes, this is more regarded to sensitivities. People who are sensitive to things like pollen, food toxins, sometimes funguses. And funguses can manifest a lot like food sensitivities too. And there's a big interplay there between those food sensitivities and also the environment in our bodies and how much, kind of that sugar, sweet type of damp environment we have and how the body looks to the immune system. Yeah.
I test the IgG for hidden food sensitivity.
Yep.
So
Hidden, whereas IG would be more overt.
right. So does that, if they were sensitive to something, is that an indication there's bacterial viral infection?
Not necessarily. Yeah, you probably knew the answer to that, but it's a good question. No, and what I find with the testing IG immunoglobulin-mediated sensitivities in people, food sensitivities, literally allergies, the allergic reaction is that you're building an antibody to a part of your food. So the food is being identified as non-self, and you're attacking that, basically. I mean, I'm going to try to move away from the attacking analogy, but you're building an antibody towards a food part. What happens is we'll find that when people are really weak and deficient, the chronic fatigue person, the fibromyalgic person, the person who has all these kind of classic symptoms, they're hypothyroid, fatigue, this person often will start to manifest more and more sensitivities to the point, like I said the other day, sometimes people, all they could eat, I had a person with MS, all she could eat was rice and chicken. That was it. I mean, I couldn't find anything else she could eat. But now, 3, 4, 5 years later, she eats everything. She eats anything she wants to. And she makes her decisions based on, most of the time she's eating a diet that I would recommend. Pretty much lots of vegetables, good fats, a little bit of protein. But then she can mess around a little bit too without any problems. So if you test these people over time, you'll find that their sensitivities are changing. Their immunoglobulin reactivity is changing. So it's not a set thing. For a while it seemed like everybody said, oh, I'm allergic to this. I'm allergic to that. And not to say that there aren't certain things. People have enzymes missing. They have certain genetic changes that they are sensitive to something and they'll never get over it. We haven't figured those out yet. But the general sensitivities that people have to all kinds of foods, you see people come in and go, oh, I got my allergy test. It's not like they have to avoid those foods for the rest of their life. I've watched a lot of people improve their ability to eat different foods by getting their essence built up, stabilizing their system, calming down the reactivity, cooling down their fires. I kind of think of like building up lots of good firemen, right, with lots of hoses and lots of water to put out those fires, the inflammatory fires that drive the immune system to build antibodies, okay?
Have you found that with IgA as well as IgG?
IgA, I haven't used it nearly as much, and I don't test these. They always come, I have doctors who I work with who send me tests, and I've got a couple that always test people. But IgA, I think you might want to see it. That's kind of a question for Neil maybe, but it probably would be more in things like sarcoid or other lung-related diseases, throat problems. I don't know if it's more specific.
Yeah.
Hard to say.
Key is creating homeostasis, because an immune dysfunction, you can always move that immune dysfunction back to a balance.
Right. You can moving the immune system back to balance.
The key is regulating the chemokines, which are chemical messengers. Okay, and these things drive autoimmunity.
Right.
Things are,
Yeah.
interleukin 6, high levels of this, it will drive an autoimmunity. So if you can regulate those, you can restore immunity.
So Alan's talking about regulating chemokines, things that incite the immune system to get reactive and calm those things down. Alan, just in I don't know if we need to get too deep into this IgA, the different immunoglobulins, but I just want you guys to have a basic understanding that immunoglobulins are antibodies that are built in response to antibody generators. That's basically what I wanted to convey.
The IgA is especially important in protecting transport across the mucous membrane, such as in the gut. And when you have gluten sensitivity, there's one laboratory called Epic Labs that measures IgA in stool for gluten sensitivity. When we have skin disease, sometimes associated with gluten sensitivity, known as dermatitis herpetiformis, if you look along the junction of the epidermis and the dermis, along the basement membrane, you'll see a deposition of IgA at that right along the junction in these people. And so it has certain roles related to gluten, certain things related to
And definitely in any GI testing, secretory immunoglobulin A is one of the main markers, and it can either be low, it can be high, it can be reactive to a parasite or to a food, or it can be depressed in that your body's not making it because you're deficient. Your immune system, your gut is really lacking, it's beat up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on from that slide. So autoimmunity, let's just talk about loss of tolerance to the self. So this is where self versus non-self breaks down, where basically the body has decided it can't figure out what's going on in a situation, in a certain context, and you've identified part of you as an antigen. So part of you is an antibody generator. So you're making an antibody to your own tissue. That makes sense, right? That's the basic what is autoimmunity. Okay? Now, in general, the immune system is trained to see aspects of self and say, and actually there's like a training program that we've identified in the thymus that trains T cells to look at the body, and if the T cells during the training program identify self as non-self and say, hey, we need to make an antibody, the immune system says, nope, that cell line goes away, and apoptosis is induced, and those cells are not kicked out of camp. So we're actually training ourselves all the time to really be careful about selecting this self versus non-self. Okay? So inhibitory feedback is where if the body reacts to something, now I'm just going to describe for you what happens. So let's say a person's under a lot of stress, the body's a little bit inflamed, there's already a tension existing somewhere, and something happens, an acute stress occurs. During that acute stress, let's say there's an injury. Tissue gets broken apart, blood cells are opened, the immune system is called into action, inflammatory processes come in to heal the area, coagulatory mediators get involved, the complement cascade comes in, the clotting cascade comes in. All these aspects of our physiology at the microscopic level come together to fix the problem, to help us move through this trauma, this damage. But in that process, let's say that because this person was chronically stressed, they had some pathological factors that were existing. Let's say they had like a yeast infection that was resultant from them having much too much sugar in their diet, having what we would call a spleen dampness syndrome in Chinese medicine. We look at this idea of turbidity in Chinese medicine. I used the metaphor of the pond, right, earlier. I don't know if you guys heard that idea that if the spleen is a pond, because in Chinese medicine they geographically mapped the human body into the geography of the land. So certain mountains and lakes and things represent different organs. The pond is the spleen, whereas the stomach is a high mountain lake. The high mountain lake tends to get dry. The low pond tends to get wet and sticky. Okay? So the spleen tends to get wet and sticky. Remember, that's the pancreas, the duodenum, part of the stomach function and part of the spleen function, all together as the functional Chinese medicine spleen. When that pond is full of sticky, muddy, methane-producing, bubbling goo, it's not working very well. Okay? The water's not clear anymore. It's all cloudy. So in the body, when dampness occurs, this damp material, which then becomes what we call phlegm, which is even dampness that got even worse, we have a progression. Body fluids, harmful body fluids, dampness, and phlegm are on a spectrum. So once you get to the phlegm place, phlegm is in the blood vessels. It's sticky, it's gooey, it's like, what's going on? Nothing can move around quite well. It's not clear, like you're underwater and you're looking for what's going on and you can't see very clear. It's all cloudy under there. What's going on? So imagine the immune system is coming to this site of this big event that took place, and cells are burst open, blood vessels are burst open, tissues have been exposed, all bits of me are showing itself out, and pieces that normally aren't being shown because they just got all blown apart. And then the immune system comes in, and all these boot camp survivors that came through and said, okay, what's me and what's not me? They're all going through, and they're looking, and they're like, God, I can't even see what that thing is. I don't know. And then they get the stimulus, go get it, because there's all this inflammatory chemokine action happening. Okay, we're going to grab that thing and pull it back and see what it is. Okay, let's make an antibody to it. Boom, antibody goes, and that little piece was you. Now you're part of the process. And even though the disease, your trauma gets over, you get through it, the bruise goes away, the bone heals, whatever. Now because of that process and what happened, your body is still making that antibody to that part of you because that part of you is continually showing up in cells all over the place. So you start to have the beginning of disease. One that comes up most commonly is rheumatoid arthritis. Most autoimmune disease is rheumatoid arthritis. There's a lot of systemic lupus erythematosus as well, SLE, right? There's a whole host of autoimmune diseases that come out of this occurrence of, darn, we just tagged self as non-self. So how do you reverse that? Well, that's tricky. So it's, again, back to the cancer idea too, we can do a lot more up front preventing this from happening than we can once the active disease process is in motion. It's much harder to tone down a disease process and cure it than it is to stop it from occurring. Okay? And I know great, we all have, we're dealing with autoimmune patients all the time, but I just want to, where we can do our greatest work as herbalists is in prevention, honestly. It just is. But we have to have a way to understand how do we prevent things. And I'll just get back to sugar and diet, because if you get the sugar out, you're going to reduce the dampness. And dampness is what is confounding the immune system's ability to see self versus non-self. Is that absolutely clear? Okay? And heat will do the same thing. If you've got a lot of heat in your body, if you're running a hot system with a lot of inflammation, those inflammatory cytokines and inflammatory mediators, we've got things like tumor necrosis factor alpha, nuclear factor kappa beta, transforming growth factor beta. We've got all these different compounds that induce cellular function. They induce action and reaction in the immune system to do things. When all that stuff gets going, it's hard to shut it down. That's why when most of these things start going, you go to the doctor, what do they give you? Steroids. Why do they give you steroids? Because that's what our body does to keep us from getting into this problem. It uses cortisone, or hydrocortisone, cortisol, the active form. Hydrocortisone is made from our adrenal cortex. It's what goes, as soon as that stressful event happens, boom, you release a bunch of cortisol, and it calms down that response. It shuts down the cycle of generating inflammation and finding the problem. Oh, no, it's okay. We're okay. Everything's okay. It's okay. We're good now. Let's go back to where we were. So let's imagine we've got back to my lecture yesterday. It's the person who's chronically stressed. They're adrenal fatigue. They're just low output of steroids, okay, in their own body. They get into that situation. Bam, they've already got the dampness. They're not feeling very well. Everything's kind of confusing. The immune system gets activated, and then the immune system starts going out of control. And they've got little fires burning, and it starts showing up in their joints, and they've got pain everywhere. And the body's going, okay, let's turn it off. Let's turn it off. And the adrenals are going, I don't have it. We don't have it. So what do? It just rages out of control. That's why people go to steroids. And that's why steroids work. But they work in the short term, because what do they also do? They inhibit your own production of steroids. And what happens when steroid levels are high? Your immune system function goes down. So if you're on them for any length of time, not only are you risking your bone health, your cardiovascular health, your neurological health, you're also risking infections because you've just suppressed your immune function. So do you guys understand the cyclical nature, right? Once things get going, we need to shut it down, calm it down. And if we don't do a good job of that, we just run further into autoimmunity. And that's just how it manifests for some people. There's all kinds of other named diseases that show up, right? There's a host of them that can go. And cancer is another one of them. You'll find, though, that in your practice, if you dig with people, and ever since I started thinking about this, how stress relates to autoimmunity and how stress relates to disease, I started seeing it all the time. And first I thought, well, it's kind of like the thing where you buy a new car, and then you're like, oh my God, everybody drives a Subaru. There's Subarus everywhere, I didn't notice it before. And so I was wondering, well, because that happens all the time. I'm like, I start studying something, and then suddenly, bam, there's that patient and that patient. Like, I just had an Ehlers-Danlos patient, came to me a month ago. Today, 2 patients in this room came to me and said, I have Ehlers-Danlos. I'd never even heard of the disease. Well, I heard of it, but never seen it, It's very interesting. What is it? Yes, they have. And actually, it's a destabilization of the mast cells, and most people are double-jointed. It's a double-jointed thing with ligament laxity, which goes back to what I was saying yesterday. Adrenal kidney essence fatigue, liver blood deficiency, ligament laxity, it all goes together. You can still treat it. My guy's actually getting better. We'll see how long that lasts, but yeah. Predisposing factors to autoimmunity. The genetic and epigenetic predispositions. And there are some genetic issues that are purely in the genes of people, but most of the problems, I think, are in the epigenetic domain. Which genes are turned on or off? Are they functioning appropriately or are they not functioning? Do they make the right protein or do they not make it? Do they make a lot of it or do they not make much of it at all? And we can test for some of that. They're called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that tell us kind of how is a person, metabolizing one compound to another. How are they dealing with methylation? Are they methylating well? Are they sulfating? Are they glycating? Are they glucuronidating? All these things that you can do, we can kind of evaluate that and see what some of the possible predispositions are for people. Environmental conditions, obviously the toxic overload and burden, our food choices, our constant exposure to things that we call antigens, our constant exposure to what could potentially be antibody generators, right? Hormones, most of the time I find these autoimmune diseases occur on the deficiency level. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, vitamin D, remember I said it's a hormone. The hormones are deficient. They're weakened. The people don't have the anabolic rebuilding signal, so they're getting friable. As we age, our hormone levels just decline naturally, and we all get a little drier. We're all getting a little we're kind of starting to prune up. It's just kind of part of our life process. We're drying up. Our hormones are going away. And, we've been seeing that. And essence is what makes us in Chinese medicine, and you're depleting your essence over time. So as you get to a certain age, your essence is so low, your hormone levels are so low, you're just more susceptible to the inability to cool, quench, and cool down the reaction that your body has to the trauma or to the antigen. Infections in the immune system, viruses can cause autoimmune disease. Viruses are amazing. They are actually going in and affecting our RNA, changing our DNA. They're actually making replicants of our genetic material. They lead to cancer, huge viral and cancer link, and a huge viral link to autoimmune disease. And if you have a bacterial infection that's lingering and lingering, or a fungal infection that's lingering and lingering, it's changing the environment. It's changing the course of your immune system, and it's confusing the system so that you end up with a bigger opportunity for your body to mistake self for non-self again. Dietary insults, I think we've got that one. Essence deficiency, that's the other part I've been thinking about. When it's depleted, that's when we find these things show up. Yes?
I was just wondering about the sugar. Some people say that all sugar is equal as far as if you eat a lot of fruit or drink a lot of juice, that's the same as cane sugar. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll tell you what, if a person has autoimmune disease and it's pretty flared up, any sugar is sugar, okay? But if a person day to day is just wanting to live a good, healthy life, fruits are generally pretty good, and people who have a good, stabilized blood sugar, their adrenals are functioning well, their cortisol's balanced, they're in harmony, they can deal with sugar. Sugar comes in and they answer the call to sugar and it's fine. So, but obviously don't go out and eat a bunch of sugar. It's just, over time, it's going to rust your blood vessels, especially the little capillaries in your eyes. It's going to lead to oxidative damage. It's going to drive your stress response energy system. It's going to give you that elevated heart rate, all that stuff. Sugar drives that stress response. So we don't want to do it very often. Fruits are a little different, and every fruit has and every food has a glycemic index, how much sugar is in it. It has a glycemic load. How long does it take that sugar to be broken down and delivered to the bloodstream? So like a carrot has a pretty high index, but it doesn't have the load is fine. You can eat all the carrots you want. But if you strip away all the fiber and all the lignans and you juice that carrot, all the sugar is right there and the glycemic load goes way up. Okay? So you just try to eat low glycemic load stuff in general, and if you're in acute situations, remember guys, I just want to clear up the thing about the chocolate, because, I was saying, you guys, remember, the first 3 weeks of my adrenal rescue plan, the first 3 weeks, possibly 3 months for some people, no chocolate, okay? That's not a lifelong thing. It's just for now, okay? And chocolate is amazing. It has great benefit. When your body is in harmony, when your hormones are full and replete, when your bike is running along, you can go right through the mud bog. It's no problem. But if you're wobbling already, you hit the mud, you go down, okay? Does that analogy make sense? Okay. Okay. The immune system can also have defects in it too, and that's where some of the genetic stuff comes in. Some people have just defects, they do, and the diseases show up because genetically they're predisposed. I had a girl with a disease called Machado-Joseph's disease. It's a spinal ataxia, and her cells just made this ataxin-3, this protein, and man, it was everything I could do to help her. I got her on a drug called dantrolene, a neurologist friend of mine, which helped relax her muscles. But, her grandmother had it, then her mom had it, and she had it. And each generation is progressively faster and faster. And by 26, she was walking like this. at the festival, they're like, "You're drunk. What are you doing?" And she's just like, "Oh my God, my life sucks." You know, and I kept doing like almost nothing for her. She saw the best specialist in the world. She said, "Oh wow, you're doing dantrolene and you're on these nutrients and things. That's the best we can do for you." So some things are just there, and we do our best to help them, and hopefully we'll find solutions. There's a whole network, obviously, and there's lots of ataxias like that are just hard to treat. So which brings me to the next thing, which is Chinese medicine and autoimmunity. So we have this statement right here I really like. The normal qi must be deficient before the evil can take the opportunity to invade. The internal existence of normal qi, we call it also upright qi, will prevent the interference by the evil. Okay? They didn't have microscopic biology when all this was being created. They didn't even dissect the body until way later to determine what was going on. It was all observational, functional, relationships, principles. But they learned a lot. But they didn't know about autoimmune diseases. They just treated what they saw. If they had redness in the joints and pain, it was blood stagnation and heat or damp heat or wind damp heat or wind damp cold in the joints. And then they would treat those things with plants that countered the nature of their disease. And they could be very helpful in that way. But this idea that the normal qi must be deficient before this can happen, again, we're back to the bike ride, right? If you're on the bike and you're just not pedaling and you're just kind of wobbling and suddenly the mud puddle hits, it's just you want to have momentum, okay, to make it through this stuff, especially these traumas. We've talked a lot about aging and kidney essence deficiency. Chronic stress depletes the essence. And what I was saying yesterday, guys, is that the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys. They're the suprarenal glands. They direct how much essence you're going to use at any given moment and what it's going to look like. Okay? This principle is important because even once we keep going and just reducing the body to every tiny little part that we possibly can, we're never going to know everything. We're never going to know how it works based on all of its parts. If we can take all the pieces and parts and understand them and then apply principles, I keep applying my principles to the microscope. I don't stop with my principles. Just because you broke it down into these things and these things and these things, this is what they do, doesn't tell you how to treat a person. So that's really important for me. And so with this, this idea of chronic stress, you're driving the adrenals to constantly release essence in the form of cortisol. And it's not that you don't use essence every day, all day through what you do. It's just that when you drive the cortisol system, you're robbing the other half of your hormone system, your DHEA to your testosterones and your estrogens and your progesterone. They're not getting what they need, which is more essence to build them. It's all going towards the stress hormones. And it's adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, it's cortisol and cortisone, mineralocorticoids. Those things are taking away your energy to rebuild yourself. And the longer you run the stress program in your mind and in your body, the faster your essence is going to burn out. And once your essence is burnt out, you break down the quenching network. And that's my term for how we deal with putting out the fire. Okay? And I talked yesterday about the cost of doing business in an oxygen-rich environment. Okay? We live in oxygen. We burn sugar. In the presence of oxygen, we create free radicals. We've got to deal with those free radicals, so we create quenching systems. Right? Every ATP molecule that's being built generates free radicals. Superoxide, the first one, you quench it with superoxide dismutase. Then that becomes hydrogen peroxide radical. You quench that with glutathione. Then that glutathione is conjugated and moves out of the body and strips away as many of those free radicals as it can fit on its receptors, and then you get rid of it. But you've got to keep rebuilding those quenchers all the time. Outside of having a defect of energy metabolism, if you're not doing the ATP cycle right, if you're missing cofactors or you've got genetic problems, you can't make the cofactors, they don't get present, you're not making ATP efficiently, that's one thing. Or if you feed it a bad fuel in your fire, and what you get is a smoky product, it's a smoldering fire that makes a bunch of nasty smoke and doesn't give you much energy, that's a problem too. But a lot of this stuff comes back to not being able to quench the fire, not being able to cool it down, especially in autoimmunity, because once the fire gets going, we need to put it out. Fire is great. We use it all the time. It has its place in nature. It has its place in our bodies. It's what gives us life. We need it, but we have to be able to calm it down and cool it down. That's the quenching network. And I use glutathione as the main one because it's one that is ubiquitous in our cells, in every mitochondria in our body. Every trillions of little stars burning in our bodies, they have to have a way to cool that fire. Kidney essence is the solution, okay? You need to have kidney essence to make the compounds that cool down the fires. Is that absolutely clear? We're good on that, right? Oh, God, nobody said anything. Is that good or bad? Good? Okay, good. Simplifying things a little bit, because I just want to, it's so hard to do a lecture and feel like you gave enough information and at the same time you didn't give too much. So that's why I like to check in with people. Are we giving it too much? It's like being a doctor in medicine. You can give a patient too little medicine, or you can give them too much medicine. Either way feels like you did something not quite right, And I actually, a lot of people, because they're afraid to give too much medicine, will give not enough medicine, so they're not effective. Some people are too aggressive to give too much medicine, and people get sicker. And that's not good either. So the artistry is finding the perfect place where you give the person the right amount of medicine. And it has to do with their disease. It has to do with their comfort zone. I always like the idea of the shaman taking a person on a little journey, come into your office and sit down with you. You meet them at a place and they're like, okay, here I am. This is what's going on for me. And you say, okay, well, here's what I want to do. I want to give you some medicine and we're going to go on a journey. We're going to go a little ways past what you normally are doing in your life. You're going to have some things you're going to add. You can take some herbs, some nutrients. We're going to change your diet, change your lifestyle a little bit. We're going to make a change, And are you ready for that? And we talk about it, we're clear, and then we go away from comfort zone. And then that person either does really well, and you can go with them and make sure that you're with them and you're comforting them, and you can bring them back to that place. Are we good? Are we checking? Keep checking in. It's like a lot of times you lose contact with people, and they kind of, they're off their comfort zone. I don't feel good, and they go back to whatever they're doing before. So it's this nurturing and tending of the relationship so that you can bring people a little ways out of their comfort zone and keep stretching it a little bit further to give them the right amount of medicine. And it's a constant process. How much medicine can a person take? And it's about anything. It's like a chiropractic adjustment or an osteopathic treatment. It's about giving someone bryonia or how much or not. How do you do it? Magnesium is a great example. Don't give someone 1,500 milligrams if you've never treated them before. They come back and say, "Good God, I just for days." And that patient's going to be not feeling too good. Well, and I didn't talk. I have like 6 different kinds in my clinic. Magnesium malate. I'll just run through quick. Malate, malic acid for the muscles. And you can dose those separately. You can do malic acid and do like 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day, even 1 to 2 grams a day. Skins of apples, watermelons are very rich in malic acid. Very good for muscle pain. That allodynia, remember what I was talking about? Pain that doesn't normally occur. And then the magnesium. Just, that's about 400 to 800 milligrams, somewhere in there. It's got to be quick, Neil. I'm out of time.
Well, I was just saying, people go and bathe at the Dead Sea,
Yep, the salts.
The active ingredient is magnesium chloride. It's like the sea.
Yep.
So if you take you can go to your local place where they sell all these.
Soaking Epsom salt baths is another way to get magnesium. I have people do it all the time.
We can get a 50-pound bag of magnesium hexahydrate.
A lot cheaper.
Water to it, and just put it on your skin.
Yeah.
And it'll absorb right through.
It's beautiful. And I use topical magnesium all the time. I love it. It's a great idea, actually, for making things a lot cheaper. But magnesium, I use magnesium taurate, one of my favorite kinds. Found to tauric acid. Tauric acid is very good for the kidney. It's taurine, that amino acid. And it's also very good for cardiovascular and neurological problems. Magnesium citrate, carbonate, and magnesium oxide. Generally, I'm using for getting magnesium into somebody. It's cheap, it's effective, but they're all more bowel stimulating. Magnesium aspartate is specifically for the nerves. And like for people who have cardiac arrhythmias, I use either taurate or aspartate. I like taurate a lot because it's the heart. And then you've got magnesium lactate, which is also very good for digestive stuff. People who are having really sensitive digestion and need help with the digestive tract, magnesium that's more focused on that part of the body. Citrate, citrate's great. And all those 3 forms, good for the kidneys. And if you want to reduce acidity in the body, use a salt. I generally use the salt, magnesium carbonate, and I use a product that's trisalts. It's kind of like sodium bicarbonate, but it's got magnesium, potassium, and calcium for people that have that sort of lactic acid feeling, kind of burning in the body. Cancer patients with elevated LDH, I use that to regulate their pH. Men with prostate cancer with elevated pH in their urine, give them the trisalts. You give them salts to bring up their pH, and it'll calm down some of the system. Remember, guys, you can't change the pH of the blood. Don't think you can. You'll be in the hospital in a heartbeat if it happened. You'd be basically dead. 7.38, I think, is about 7.3 to 7.42, something like that. Is pretty much. It's maybe a little lower. It's a tightly controlled system, but you can change how much buffer you have. Okay. So if you give the person alkaline buffer, the body can pull that buffer from the new reserve you gave rather than trying to pull it from other tissues, where those tissues can be depleted of their potassium, their magnesium, their calcium, their sodium, and then those tissues suffer. and a person's constantly running what's called metabolic acidosis. So you can support that, but don't change the blood of the patient. You can't, okay? Just a misconception just to clear up. So on the backdrop of chronic stress, we have major stress, all right? This is when that big event happens. I kind of already explained this, right? Just to say there's a lot of data on this stuff. I spent a lot of time digging through all the research. There's so much data on how most patients with autoimmunity have had an acute stress, major stress trauma before they got their diagnosis. And it's big stuff. It's divorce. It's a loss of a child or a loved one. It's being fired from your job. It's going bankrupt. It's, it's moving and selling your house or having your house burned down. It's this kind of stuff. But it's also a car accident. I mean, car accidents are way bigger than human proportion. They just are. We're in a car going 70 miles an hour. It's just not sustainable for us. Car accidents are huge, and they just set up this big response, and if you don't have the reserve to put the response out, when it's done, it just starts raging out of control. Interesting thing, chronic stress suppresses leukocyte activity, so it suppresses the immune system over time. That's why people get infections. This is back to chronic fatigue, right? These infections show up. You're not managing the system very well. And I want to just kind of clear up, too, one thing about the idea that we're fighting infection. And I think it's all about finding balance. It's not about we want to kill all the bugs. It's about we want to find the right ratio of everything to everything else. And I believe that these viruses, these bacterias, these spirochetes, these funguses live inside of us and through us and around us. And they're everywhere. They just need to be in harmony. Like I said before, you can get a big dose of one and have a problem with it, especially if you're depleted. But if you're really strong and really solid, it's hard for your balanced flora to get thrown off. You stabilize it. Timing of stress, I'm just going to leave that as, once that acute stress happens, if you're not ready for it, and this is the thing I was saying before. Yesterday I was talking about juggling, and juggling 7 balls in my life. I've just been doing a lot, and you're kind of walking the tight wire, and you're using up a lot of your energy to stay focused, and oh my God, then suddenly something happens. You get knocked off that tight wire, or a wind hits. It's something out of the blue, something you didn't plan for. A lightning bolt strikes you. You never know. You want to be prepared for that event, though, by leaving some extra. Leave some room in your life to deal with when your mom dies. To deal with when you're getting sick or a family member is getting sick and you've got to take care of them. You've got to drop everything else. The emotional stress that's going to occur requires you to have a reserve of that essence. Your bank account needs to have some essence in it for you to use. If you don't have it, problems. Stress triggers and cascades. 80% of patients in this study reported uncommon emotional stress before disease onset. So I just wanted to clarify that it's not just the physical stress, it's the emotional stress. And it's a cycle. Once the stress starts, it doesn't, it's the stress that causes the disease, but then it's the disease itself causing the stress, and then the stress causing the disease, and it's a cycle. The cycle is so hard to overcome. It's self-generating. So once you have an alteration of the cytokines that we talked about, this is when things start to go aberrant and things start to get crazy. And when we'll talk about the herbs that we use, you've got to calm down the reaction as well, help the person calm it down, but then long term we're going to give them what they need to do that job on their own. That's why steroids don't work long term. So a little bit about vaccines. You guys are familiar with vaccines, and this is such a charged issue. I don't even want to, I can just imagine how many sides of it there are. I'm going to have to keep going. I only got 20 minutes or so. And so I want to just talk about vaccines for a minute. But, the difference between the vaccine-delivered immune response, which is, of course, the adaptive immune response, you're building an antibody to something. So you're getting a dose of something that, it's the tetanus, virus, for example, or it's the polio vaccine, whatever it might be. You're getting a dose of the invading pathogen, but it's not the invading pathogen itself. It's a part of it, it's a damaged version of it, or a slowed version of it. So you're not actually getting what happens when you get the disease. When you get the virus or the bacteria and it sets up its camp in your body and it starts changing the environment, creating a damp heat condition, changing the inflammation that's in the bloodstream, changing the environment, your body meets that and recognizes it and builds a full response. First you respond to it immediately with your innate response, and then you build your antibody system to it. When you give the vaccine, it's a more subtle response because it's not the full disease. Sometimes the diseases are given with a weakened form of the virus, And it gets people sick. It does happen sometimes, not often, but there's enough of it there that if you're really weak, it doesn't work. So I'm not going to tell anybody here what to do about vaccines. Do you vaccinate your kids or not? Do you vaccinate people or not? Does everybody need to get all these vaccines or not? It's not that simple. I keep thinking of it as, who is the person? What's the context in which they live? And then, can I support them in a way that they don't need the vaccine? Or can I support them in a way that makes the vaccine much more safe for them? So, take a person, a kid, young, really weak, never sucked on, never went to the breast, was really deficient, just really having a hard time. Don't inject that kid with a vaccine, with some virus, with a bunch of adjuvants in it that can be reactive, that are going to stimulate its immune system. The kid's really deficient. We need to get that kid built up first, and so we can give him herbs. Herbs work great with vaccines. So if you're going to do them, try to get the person feeling good beforehand. On the same side of the coin, if a person's really weak and their immune system is just not well and they get sick everywhere they go, and they're headed into a country where you've got huge epidemic of hepatitis B, get them a hepatitis B vaccine. You know what I mean? So it's about context. And we find also that if you give things like echinacea, there's some great data on echinacea with vaccines. Adaptogenic herbs are great to give with vaccines. People should be taking their adaptogenic tonic with their vaccinations if they're going to do them. It's just not so simple. Everybody wants to make the simple statement. Yes, everybody should have a vaccine, or no, people shouldn't get vaccines. And it's just not that simple. We've got to stop polarizing. So herd immunity is one of the selling points of vaccines, right? So the idea is that if you guys all get vaccines, you're all protected from the virus, and if I'm too weak to take the vaccine, I'll be protected because you guys aren't going to get sick. It's a great, it's a great sales tactic, but it's also got some, logic to it too. But I'm much more interested in my community becoming strong. My herd should be strong because they're taking essential fats. They got off the sugar. They're eating vegetables. They're taking herbs. They're keeping their nutrients straight. They're seeing a practitioner who helps keep their bike running at a high speed. So when we get hit with some kind of virus, it stops right here. Not because we predicted one of the 18 that might have hit, but because we're ready for any challenge that might come. That's where my idea is. And if we need vaccines, we can use them. And remember, the adjuvants, those are the things that we put adjuvants in there, not just to preserve it, but to stimulate the immune system to go after that part of the virus or the bacteria. And the adjuvants sometimes really don't work for people. People are really weak. They got chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. They're just deficient. They get those adjuvants, and they get this little bit of an infection, and they just go crazy. Their body just kind of freaks out over it. They get a kind of like mercury toxicity feelings, and there's all these weird links to things, and everybody's on some side of it. But I just get back to the idea that if the person's really weak, consider first building them up before you give them a vaccine. And make sure you use the vaccine in a context that makes sense. There's no replacement for sleep. I've experienced that myself. I've tried to see if I could test that hypothesis. One of the things about sleep I think is really amazing is that when you go to the deepest layers of sleep, you're gone. You're not here. You're not dreaming. You're not in your body. Where are you? I feel like that's our connection to Source again. You have to drop back to where you connect with Source, whatever that is, whatever your idea about when we die or how that is. That's beautiful. It's your story. I'm not convinced that there is one story. I just know that I don't know, but I trust in me that there's something beautiful, there's something deeper, something bigger that I'm a part of. And when I go to sleep, I feel like that's where I go. And if I don't get to that point, I feel like I don't reconnect with the source of where I come from, the energy that makes me, the thing that we can't explain with science that we never will. So make sure you get your patients to that deep place of sleep.
Do you have a viewpoint about the effects of Ambien?
I think Ambien is really sketchy. Yep, really sketchy. And it doesn't work for a lot of people, and it's got the list of side effects has been pretty interesting. Even driving while dreaming. People are in their car driving, getting pulled over because they're driving erratically, and they're on Ambien sleeping. So it's changing the physiology. I think it's a GABA agonist. Yeah. Somebody? Are you guys good?
It doesn't take them into a deep sleep.
I don't think so. No. I mean, that's I think in all those the drugs that are used to put people in sleep, Valium, the tricyclic depressants and the benzodiazepines, they don't get you to that place of connection to source. They rest you to a certain degree, and they can be temporary to give you just enough energy to pull through. And sometimes people need that. They're they cannot sleep. I've tried with some people, I just can't get them to sleep. And then they use that for a time while you support them. It's like the Band-Aid on top, and then you fix the wound from underneath, and then you pull away that. And be careful, benzodiazepines are very addictive. Opiates too. And that's why I want to hit medical cannabis, because out in Oregon we have medical cannabis, and it's becoming an amazing tool right now in the toolbox of things we have. Just a little bit about eating. Chew your food. Take time. Don't watch TV while you're eating. Focus on eating. Prepare your own food once in a while, or if not, every day. And eat good food. We talked about that yesterday. What is a good food? What's good food? I gave you those 13 foods I want you to avoid. One of my friends, Sean, was like, that's great you told me those 13 foods to avoid, but just tell me what to eat. So I'm really working on that part of it. It's been a long road. Eventually, we'll get there. Hormones and immune function. I just want to say that any of these hormones are depleted, you're going to be more likely to get an autoimmune disease. It's just more likely. And it's that situation where you've exhausted everything, you're at the end of your rope, and the rope breaks. At that point, you want to have your backup rope, or you want to have your second parachute. That's your deeper level of essence.
You mentioned before about testing vitamin D.
Yeah.
So, what's your goal for a person in vitamin D level?
Perfect. Perfect question. Well, there was a study that came out about 3 years ago that looked at Kenyan... Oh, sorry, guys. Yeah, the question is, what about vitamin D? How do you determine where the level is? How do you get it back to normal? And what is normal? So consider this, okay? All human beings on the earth live at different latitudes. We're all connected to a different genetic blood lineage. And different latitudes provide different amounts of sunlight, okay? Sunlight converts vitamin D in our bodies to the active form. We manufactured vitamin D, 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol and 25-hydroxy. Both these compounds start from sunlight hitting our skin, and then we have a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, that converts our vitamin D that we get from dietary sources into the active form that we have in our storage form of D that we use. So what happens in Kenya is people have very, very dark skin. For thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, they have had very little clothing. They've lived in outdoor settings. They didn't have cars. They didn't have buildings. They didn't have schools. They were outside. Nature was their school. They got a lot of sunlight on the plains. They got a lot of sunlight in Africa and other places in the world where people have dark skin. The dark skin, the melanin, protects these people from getting too much vitamin D. And then their SNPs are very slow. They metabolize that vitamin D very slowly. Otherwise, they would make so much vitamin D all the time, they'd be sick. Because before we tested vitamin D in the blood, doctors would give huge amounts of vitamin D until the patient got sick. They would get nausea and vomiting. Well, that was enough. Stop giving it to them. They didn't have any other way to look at it. So the study that came out showed that the average vitamin D level, the storage form, 25-hydroxy, is 47 in Kenyan people tested who are living in a traditional lifestyle, not living in the city, not driving a car. Okay? So there's all kinds of differing opinions. My general goal is 50 to 70 in most people. Cancer patients, 60 to 80, sometimes up to 100. And then if you have any kind of a sarcoidosis or a lymphoma, you've got to be careful. You don't just give people high doses of vitamin D, because you can change their ionized calcium levels and cause lots of problems. So you do have to look a little deeper in some patients. Okay? So just in mainly those two cases, sarcoidosis, be sure, and in lymphomas, look deeper. What you do is you look at their 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Like I said, I want that between 50 and 70 nanograms per deciliter. And then I want them to have a 125-dihydroxy at the same ratio, basically right at the same point in the range. So mid-range, maybe 60 in that 50-70 range, and then their active form also in the same place. If you only measure the storage form and it's low, the person might have a latent infection, and they're converting all their storage vitamin D into active vitamin D. You know why? Because vitamin D activates your macrophages. It's called vitamin D macrophage activating factor. And without it, your macrophages don't do anything. So imagine a person with a vitamin D level of 4. Well, either they have a lot of active vitamin D and all their storage is being depleted, or both are depleted and they just don't have any vitamin D. Now, if you're an African person that has a very slow SNP for metabolizing vitamin D, and you have dark skin, and you live in Minnesota, and you're in a house, and you're in a car, where are you going to get your vitamin D from? You're not. So you have to get in the sun. Or you've got to take vitamin D orally. And oral vitamin D supplementation or injectables work very well, get levels up, and people recover. I've seen people get up out of wheelchairs who had so depleted vitamin D levels that once we got it in the right range, it came up to, they were able to live their life again. Their brain came back online. The thyroid gland depends on vitamin D, and I consider it the headlights of the immune system. So when that water is deeply cloudy and you can't see what's going on and you're a T cell, if your vitamin D level is hot and happening, your macrophage is activated, everybody's together, you see right through the fog and you find self versus non-self, you make the right decision. If you don't have vitamin D, it's dark.
I've heard that if you don't bathe for 2 days, you can absorb the D from the sun, and if you bathe, you wash it off before it gets a chance to metabolize.
I don't think that's true. That sounds very odd. Yes? Yes, it's a vitamin D spot test from doctor's data. Doctor's data.
Just quickly, you're talking a lot about constitutions of people and older people, but what about very young patients that have immune issues, that haven't had, are they that depleted too when they're 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks old? Do you deal with that?
Well, the depletion can happen at birth. It can happen in the womb. It can be genetically predisposed. The person can start out with a deficit, like the boy in the bubble, like I mentioned yesterday. What happened to that person? Why are they sensitive to everything? And then it's a long process of getting them back. And the first way is pull away all the possible insults. Don't let them get insulted and get into an inflammatory reaction because they might die right there. But it could be other diseases. And a lot of things come up like little purpurae, idiopathic type of diseases come up for people, which signifies some deficiency. And it can be on the emotional level. It can be in a lot of different places. But it is also a process of finding out, is there a pathogenic factor? Is there something that you can treat on the surface? Is there heat? Is there dampness? Is there something? What triggered it? And it's not always the deficiency case. If someone gets hit with a hard enough trauma, even a strong person, they could go into this as well. It can take so much of their energy. And sometimes birth is that traumatic for people. So it's not, I'm trying to give you guys an overview of how the process starts in a lot of cases. But like I said, there are some genetic things that can be more permanent in people, where people are very predisposed, and those things are hard to treat. Stress management, helping people cope with stress, getting the diet right, lifestyle, botanical medicine, pharmaceutical therapies. Pharmaceutical therapies are useful in certain instances where you really need something fast and need something now. It's an emergent condition, an acute condition. So I'm never against any one type of medicine. My view is all of medicine is medicine, and there's no alternative. There's only collaborative medicine, and it starts with spiritual faith. It starts with Tibetan Buddhism and Reiki and healing and Tai Chi and Qigong, and it goes through massage and Jin Shinjitsu and Shiatsu, and it goes into acupuncture and chiropractics and osteopathic manipulations. It goes into botanical and nutritional medicine and botanical extracts and potentized plant compounds. It goes into low-dose pharmaceuticals and high narrow therapeutic index pharmaceuticals. It goes into drugs that are specific for the immune system or drugs that are specific for cancer, chemotherapies, to radiation, to surgery. And that whole spectrum of things is medicine, guys, every bit of it. It's not about what's good and what's not good. It's about what one person needs and what combination thereof. And a lot of times you're following a patient over time and you've got to switch your strategy all the time to keep finding where you have a solution for them. Well, it's always referrals, absolutely. But it's about most of these chronic cases you need a team. You got to have a team of people. Especially cancer, you build a team. Managing stress, get your downtime in. My friends will tell you I have a lot of downtime. And counseling patients, and it's really just being with them, just be with people and allow them to express how stressed they are. My wife always tells me about how important it is to, if you haven't experienced a traumatic event, you really don't understand it, even if you feel like you do. And don't pat somebody on the back. Say it's going to be okay. If their mom died and their son died in a car accident, it's not okay. It's just be with them. Just allow the process to happen. And in any way you can help them to be there to support whatever they need, great. But people have to be real about what is really happening for themselves. And if they need to go through that stress, it's got to be gone through in a real way. I want to talk about the biome a little bit. There's been a lot of talk about it. It's just the flora and fauna, the perfect balance. Our intestines, our microvilli, our simple columnar epithelial cells of our brush border of our intestines, where that secretory immunoglobulin A is, where all these different bacteria are living, all these probiotics, all these different organisms. We have microorganisms from viruses. Now we have things like mycobacterias, and we have a number of different things we haven't even understood yet that are starting to come out, and what actually lives inside of us. And there's more DNA in us by thousands-fold than there is us. So we are on borrowed ground. So what's happening at that interface, just like a tree that's out in the soil, the tree isn't living in the soil. The tree is living in communities of networked organisms that symbiotically change the soil into something that's usable by the tree. And the tree provides something to those living creatures, and they provide something back. It's exactly what's happening in our intestines. We are filling our intestines with soil. The roots are our lacteals, these columns of cilia that are interacting with the environment. That's what's happening. We're in the soil. So remember, guys, the soil is so important. What lives at that border defines how the compounds are, what's being made there, what's being exchanged. Are the cells working together tightly, or are they getting gapped? You get dysbiosis or not? Is things functioning really, really well or not? It depends on these organisms. I'm going to skip diet. And I want to talk about medicinal mushrooms a little bit. They are amazing. And do not get fooled into thinking that medicinal mushrooms can't be used in cases where people are doing drugs for chemo and people have autoimmune diseases and things like that. I want to talk about reishi specifically. That mushroom is so incredible. Ling Zhi, the spirit mushroom. Ling is spirit. It's the character in Chinese medicine is two people sitting under a tree praying for rain. That's the actual meaning of Ling, the spirit. So this mushroom has huge value to these people. And it grows all over in this area, right here, growing on the hemlocks in this area. They're beautiful, big, beautiful chunks of this mushroom. It smells just so right and so rich. It's nourishing to the spirit, and it has such an incredible action in our body. So many things it does. Tonifies the qi, nourishes the yin in the blood of the body, strengthening the spleen. It gets rid of that dampness. So imagine you had that sticky bog. Reishi's great. It helps get rid of that bogginess and clear the spleen up again, help your digestion, help things move. And it nourishes the yin. The yin and the blood, that's that stuff that your essence is becoming to cool down those reactive fires that your body's making in response to the trauma. So Ling Zhi has many applications. I use it in huge doses a lot, but I always use it in a good therapeutic extraction. Okay, people nowadays are using autoclaves. They take the mycelium and they grow the reishi on a rice grain or another kind of grain, and they put it in an autoclave bag. They grow it in there, then they autoclave it. And then they take it and they dry it and they powder it and they sell it because it has a lot of polysaccharides. There's no data on that stuff. Zero. Nothing. All the research and all the traditional usage for thousands of years comes from the whole plant with the mycelium and the fruiting body being taken and cut into pieces, decocted, soaked for an hour, decocted for 35 minutes, and then also do an alcohol extraction as well nowadays, which you don't necessarily have to do because agitation from boiling breaks up all those alcohol-soluble components and gets them in the liquid as well. That's how you get the right amount. But you can also take the powder, which has been extracted in that way. I use a company called JHS Mushrooms or Namex, North American Medicinal Mushrooms. They're both out in Oregon. They both make great extracts. And I use a 5-to-1 to 20-to-1. I don't want to go too high because I want the full spectrum. I want the terpenoids and I want the polysaccharides. And the polysaccharides are rich in mushrooms. They're in the cell walls. They're the beta and alpha glucans that make up the structure of the mushrooms. So they have to, the reason we have to boil them is we've got to break those things out of the cell walls. If you just eat the mushroom, you don't get it. You've got to break it apart, agitate it, heat it, and then you get those things into the solution, and you take them that way. You can drink it as a decoction. But if you're using it in a way like for prostate cancer, it's one of my top 3 herbs. And I use it as teaspoon doses. Teaspoons of 20-to-1 extract 2 or 3 times a day. You don't really have an upper limit of dosing on this stuff. It's not going to hurt you. It's just that at some point you're losing diminishing returns. You can take a lot more of it, but you're not getting much more benefit. So I find a half teaspoon to a teaspoon is a great dose. I do a lot of combination mushrooms, but this one in particular is so good. 10% polysaccharides, 4% triterpenes. Go for that type of a ratio. And the only time that you might question it, and I would still use it, remember, rather than base it on whether the doctor says oh, it's going to stimulate your immune system so you can't use it because the drug I'm giving you, it'll mess it up. What if the person needs that plant? What if their constitution says they're damp, they need the chi tonification and the damp drainage that this plant is going to afford them, and it's going to give them some deep support? It's okay to use the plant. There are very, very few reactive studies. There's a lot of theoretical information because these are called biological response modifiers that modify the immune system. And the pharmaceutical term, which sucks, we keep putting pharmaceutical terms on herbs. It doesn't work. We call them immune stimulators. What are you talking about? You think that reishi is going to stimulate you to go into an autoimmune attack? Never happened. It's been used for thousands of years. It doesn't do that. It modulates the immune system. And when you take things like astragalus, echinacea, and mushrooms, you put them in different contexts, guess what? They do different things.
What was the second company you mentioned, please?
North American Medicinal Mushroom Company. Extracts. JHS.
And can I ask you one more question? A source for Rapunzel?
Talk to Sean Friedman. He'll be at the Natura booth. It's a tough one to get, but he's the one. Donnie found it in Russia, and I've always had trouble getting it, but they could probably find it for you. It's a great plant. I want to talk about a little bit of echinacea too, because echinacea is another one. In our Western herbal land, the purple coneflower used by Native Americans for a long, long time has been just incredible plant that has so much value, and now it's being, the thing is, it started to become the remedy for colds and flus. And it was our, limelight, the new kid on the block, echinacea, 10 years ago, flus and colds, that's never what it was for. It's a spleen tonic. It works with the spleen energy. It works with the lung energy. It works with what we call the Wei Qi in Chinese medicine. It builds the immune function. It has polysaccharides in it, and it has alkylamides, both of which have immune modulating activity. There's a Jonathan Treasure, a good dear friend of mine, has a book from Britain that they used to treatment. They used 3 teaspoons of echinacea a day to treat Graves' disease. To great effect. I haven't done that, but I'm not afraid to use the right plant in the right person based on their presentation. Okay? Now the thing is, I'll tell you, with the 3 plants I put up here, echinacea, astragalus, one of my favorite plants of all time, and the mushrooms, is that narrow therapeutic index drugs, be careful, just because if something went wrong, even if it wasn't the plant, they're going to blame the plant.
Yeah.
Okay? AIDS drugs, retrovirals, be careful, just same problem, and immune suppressant drugs. So the mTOR inhibitors, rapamycin, sirolimus, tensorolimus, methotrexate. Methotrexate don't really worry about. It's a folate inhibitor. It's a specific pathway. But for people who have done organ transplant and they're dealing with graft versus host disease, what you can do if your doctor is amenable is if things change, they can either reduce or raise or lower the amount of the immune suppressant they're using. But you'll have to be, just make sure everybody's on the same team. Make sure that everybody knows what's going on. If a plant would support their constitution, but it could interfere with the graft versus host disease, you need to be aware of that. So those are the 3 situations where you want to be aware. But outside of that, guys, there's very little negative interaction. I know we're over time, but this is just too good at the moment. I got to hit one other thing. The alkylamides in echinacea specifically target the CB2 receptor. That's the cannabinoid receptor. That's cannabinoid 2 receptor. It's in the periphery of the body. There's CB1 and CB2. You guys, the endocannabinoid receptor system is so old that they've found it in the medusa. And one of the early multicellular organisms has cannabinoid receptors. And it's out throughout the kingdoms of our world are these receptors. So it's not like resveratrol or curcumin or a compound that's going to influence your body. No, it actually has a network that is already ready to respond to that compound that we make inside of ourselves. Endocannabinoid receptor system. So this medicine, which has been suppressed by the FDA and the DEA for so long, we haven't been able to research it. There's no data, but what we're finding, and the bits that are coming out now, is that it has profound effect on autoimmunity, has profound effects on cancer, but we don't know. There's agonizing and antagonizing the receptors, and there's different effects. We've got to be careful, but just keep your eyes out for what's happening with cannabis, and it's, it's mind-blowing. And what's happening, cannabis is my number 1 treatment for chemo-induced nausea, vomiting, but it's not oral cannabis, and it's not Marinol. Synthetic cannabinol did nothing for any of my patients ever, not once. But vaporized cannabis, even if you're in a state that doesn't allow it, if patients want to do it and they want to do it, I'll tell you, for the nausea that's intractable, there's nothing like it. It just works. I don't use it as a thing I want people to have recreationally or something, but it is like one of those tools again. It's like it's perfect for that type of thing. But the oils, the extracts that Rick Simpson kind of made famous, those things are great for different types of tumors and things. I've got one breast cancer patient on a pretty high dose of a cannabis oil right now. She also has psoriasis, and over the past 3 months of being on cannabis, her psoriasis is gone. She's had it for her whole life. Verrucas, topically, amazing. They're gone. So we're learning more and more. I was just going to say, too, echinacea is my number one go-to in leukemia. This study on mice in leukemia, it's quite phenomenal. And you can dose it high. I do 3 teaspoons a day of a good, strong menstruum extract of echinacea. It is. It's absolutely. But it's just echinacea is absolutely phenomenal. But they have very similar mechanisms. That's why I put them all together in this. But the research on echinacea, there's a woman actually in our area who did tons more research on this and showed such incredible benefit in mice that took the echinacea. And I'm talking about mice, normal mice, and leukemic mice, and giving mice with leukemia echinacea and giving mice that didn't have echinacea leukemia, these mice all died. Within 3 months, they were all gone, and all their natural killer cells were gone. The mice that took echinacea after 3 months had nearly normal levels of natural killer cells and were living on. It's really remarkable. It's not the same in humans. We might have to get the dosage even higher, I'm not sure, but I do 3 teaspoons a day, and a lot of my leukemia patients, so they do great, along with green tea and curcuma and everything else. But astragalus, I want to say one thing about astragalus. There's a part of astragalus they're called astragalosides, and one of them is called cyclooestragenol. It's TA65 is the modern name for it. You might not even know about it, Neil. But it is a telomerase inhibitor that allows for your telomeres to lengthen. So it's the only compound we've found that does this, that we've had data on it. So aging, as we age, as oxidative damage occurs, as our essence is depleted in all the ways we've talked about, the telomere lengths, which is a telomere is the genetic material. The length of the genetic material is the telomere. And when that gets to a place that's called critically short, errors occur. You can't replicate that cell effectively. So that cell either dies, or it just can't replicate, or it replicates to something that you don't want. Dysplastic, anaplastic, neoplastic cell. So to repair those telomeres, TA65 is amazing. Now, it's expensive. It's hard to extract. It's a very elaborate process to get that cyclooestragenol because you get other components as you're going through. You've got to chromatographically keep selecting for the right thing. But so what I do is I use this formula Dongui Bouchue Tong. That's the Angelica to build the blood decoction. It's a 5-to-1 ratio of astragalus to Angelica, Angelica sinensis. And I dose it anywhere from 90 to 180 grams of astragalus per 2-day dose, to a fifth of that in Angelica, and I use it with some other herbs. Like I'll put in some amomum, some Chinese cardamom. I'll put in some citrus peel, which is very good for the digestion. Just allow people to digest it a little better, especially if they're damp. Astragalus is still a little bit tonifying as a plant, so it can still be a little bit cloying. You don't want to tonify that damp, sticky spleen. That you don't want to put more nutrition, more nutrifying soil into that bog. You don't want to do that. You first got to clear the bog out, make it work better. Then you can start giving it stuff to nutrify it. Okay? So you can test the telomeres. There's actually a company in Switzerland that lets you go in and look at your telomere length. And for a while they were measuring the average length of your telomeres. And as you age, it goes down. But what we found is that that's not nearly as important as finding out how many critically short telomeres do you have. And if you have enough short telomeres, you'll be right on the edge of having a major disease, cancer being number one. So, what's that?
The flower looks like
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's very close. That's astragalus, membranosus. And that's pretty much all I have time for, guys. I want to talk about glutamine and arginine. Just one thing about glutamine, it's great for the gut. It's very rebuilding, but it's a fuel source, a lot like sugar. And so in active cancer where people are not getting treatment, chemotherapy, don't give them high doses of glutamine, okay? Don't give them huge doses of folic acid either. Don't give them things that can help cancer cells replicate unless you're actively treating the disease. Well, I don't give glutathione anyway. Right. Yeah, you don't want to support. One of the things you can do is you can tonify a pathogen, and you've got to be careful not to do that. I just want to say that with glutamine because it's such like another one of those things. I mean, glutamine is amazing, and I use a covalently bonded form, not the L-glutamine that you get in most places in the bodybuilding stores. There's a company called Well Wisdom. They make this organic free-range source of dairy whey, and they also make a really good glutamine, and it's covalently bonded, so the bonds are light, and it's easy to get into the gut, especially for folks that are compromised, especially after chemo radiation. They get a lot of rebuild from that. But like I said, Well Wisdom. And then arginine. Arginine's amazing. It's the precursor to nitric oxide, which is what your immune system uses to make bursts to kill organisms, and it also is your vasodilator, your primary vasodilator that allows your blood vessels to open. So we want to oxygenate the tissue, open the blood vessels, and it stimulates the immune system in a really organized way. It helps immune function. With lysine, it also, and give it with lysine, the herpes thing. We're back to herpes. Arginine in high doses will sometimes trigger a herpes response, so give a little lysine with it, okay? That's it.